What's going on, 3DMJers? This is the 3D Muscle Journey podcast, and today I'm speaking with Steve Taylor, our team RD, about how, when, and why you might want to transition away from tracking your macros. Now, this is something that Steve and I did for years before we actually stepped away from it. And when we did so, we found that not only were we able to still reach our goals and not have that be an issue, but it was actually better and helped us reach more optimal results. And I know some of you might hear that and think that's crazy, and you don't even believe it's possible. But not only is it possible, we think it actually might be preferable for most people and most athletes at a given point in their career, or at least at specific times, depending on what their goals are. And it, at the very least, allows more dietary freedom without having any decrease in quote-unquote optimality at certain phases. So while I don't expect you just to listen to me say that and be bought in immediately, definitely make sure you listen to this podcast with an open mind. Steve and I begin by discussing our personal histories, how we went through this process on our own, and then we get into the costs and benefits of tracking macros, because of course it's not black or white, and then also the nutritional habits that need to be in place before you transition away from tracking. Then we discuss how to measure and monitor your own hunger and fullness, what those sensations feel like, and how your emotions, environment, and psychology can really impact your satiety, hunger, and your relationship with food and affect your ability to manage your diet. You'll also hear me discuss a lot about my current transition out of prep, because I just had finished my season shortly before the recording of this podcast. I was actually only 4 weeks post-season when we had this discussion. So obviously I went from a relatively rigid diet to what is now my recovery period, and then progressing into the off-season. So that's kind of this stepwise process of getting less and less rigid and moving back towards habit-based cues. And it'll be years before I actually get on stage again, so you can kind of hear my perspective on that. So subsequently, as an athlete, I've been thinking a lot about this topic, and then also as the Chief Science Officer of 3DMJ. And I actually recently published a paper specifically on how we should be managing our nutrition as physique athletes and coaches, and moving towards a more sustainable paradigm with that. And you can find the link to that in the show notes, and I'd highly encourage you read it. But also, Steve has been instrumental in helping me contextualize how to apply these ideas and make them into concrete, practical methods and systems to help people transition away from tracking and have a more healthy, sustainable relationship with their food. In fact, we've got a course coming out that Steve and I have been working on towards the end of the year that'll be free and part of the 3DMJ Vault. So make sure you keep your eyes peeled and subscribe to the 3DMJ newsletter, which you can find a link to in the show notes, because that's going to be coming out in the future. All right, that's enough from me. Let's go ahead and dive in, and you can listen to this discussion with me and Steve. As usual, if you have any feedback or comments on this episode, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com or on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Team3DMJ, and leave any comments or questions under podcast number 135. So without further ado, enjoy this episode titled Transitioning Away from Tracking with myself and Steve Taylor, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Steve, thank you so much for being back on the 3DMJ podcast. It is a pleasure and a privilege to have you on.
Thank you for having me back on.
Awesome. So, something that you've been talking about lately, something that I've been talking about lately, something that people are talking about lately, this is a thing, is basically looking at the other side of tracking. I think we went through a period in the quote-unquote kind of evidence-based, especially the bodybuilding community, where tracking your macros was synonymous with flexible dieting, and therefore synonymous with being more mentally healthy, and therefore synonymous with #optimal. And I'm glad we've kind of taken maybe a lateral step from that, and we've been talking about why that's not necessarily always the case, and how it can even be detrimental sometimes. So I would love to hear your experience, both as an athlete and also as a nutrition practitioner, of what it's been like stepping away from tracking, and how this may have been a benefit or potentially also cause new problems for you and or your clients, and just kind of hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess probably just starting with maybe my own experience. So
Hmm.
I learned to track in 2013, and essentially from the time I started tracking, I didn't stop for it was a little over 3 years. So, and it was essentially right when I started, I had these very specific protein, fat, and carb targets. And I essentially, both in season and off season, had very specific targets for those next 3 years. And what led me to finally like get away from it was after my last contest prep in June of 2016. I was just so burned out on the whole thing. I wanted to take a break from it, and I wasn't exactly sure how to get away from it, but I knew that I needed to get away, or I would have problems with sustainability. So
Right.
I would say, I mean, I've noticed a lot of benefits from doing it. I mean, one of the biggest things, and this isn't something that I really would have, I don't know, thought about at the time, just because I was so used to tracking. I didn't really question it anymore, and I didn't really think it was that big of a deal anymore. But now that I've transitioned away and gotten away from it, I've just noticed there's just like this sense of freedom about just being able to go through my day without having to constantly use a food scale, have to constantly hop on my fitness pal when I go to restaurants, having to look up different foods. And again, like at the time, like I was just so used to that routine that I was like, if you would have told me I should transition away from tracking, I would have said it's not a big deal. I don't mind it. But then just actually experiencing what the other side is like, it's been incredible. And oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that really mirrors my experience. So there's a lot to unpack here as well, which we'll get into in a bit. I started tracking for my not for the very first time, but the first time consistently, because I did it once for like a trial cut that I did in 2006 before I was ever a competitor. When I was like, I'm going to compete, but I started tracking and didn't stop from January 2007 when I started my first prep until I moved to New Zealand in late August 2012. So I actually had more than 5 years straight of tracking, and it was got loose at certain stages, and there was post contest periods where I wasn't able to actually follow what I was intending to hit, but I kind of always knew, and I was tracking in one form or another to various degrees of strictness and what went on a scale and whether or not I ate out for over 5 years. Um, and I was the same way. It became such a habit that I was like, well, why would I not? But then when I got away from it, and for the past 7 years, not only have I found out, oh, this is actually a nice thing to not have to worry about, but I've seen some benefits I didn't expect. So yeah, I just to say, yeah, man, same experience.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know about you, but I know for me, like I notice it the most, especially when I get out of my normal routine, because that was one of the biggest things about tracking was like, okay, it really is not a huge deal when you're in your groove, but like when you travel or like you have an event come up or something like that, then it's just like it was almost like I would be at this event, and like in the back of my mind, I'd be trying to like estimate this thing or calculate this thing, or if I was traveling and my whole routine was out of whack, then it's like I was constantly having to like either hop in there and try to figure stuff out, or I just, wouldn't track in general, but then I would feel guilty about it because I thought I should be tracking, but I wasn't tracking. And so like that, and I would say that's where I really notice the most freedom is once I get out of my routine, now that I'm much more attuned to my own hunger and fullness sensations, I'm better at regulating my intake just naturally. Yeah.
Yeah. The same thing for me. I noticed I carried around this kind of like low grade constant resentment or anxiety anytime I got outside my routine. Like I will go out to eat because I hashtag flexible diet when I'm not prepping, but then I have to calculate it and estimate it. And then when it's a little more than I think, or we decide to get dessert and I look up at the end of the day and I've eaten more than I planned, I'm a little resentful. And I'm like, if I didn't get asked to go out to eat, I'd have like leaner off seasons. And like it's kind of like hating on my friends in the back of my mind, um, or just being slightly more stressed than I needed to be when traveling or when going out. Um, and yeah, and something we'll probably talk more about is just also not really thinking through how variable your energy expenditure is. And I feel like the quality of my gains in like '08 and in 2010, like all of my off seasons, I felt like I would have phases where I just gained a lot of body fat. And I noticed like when I was trying to be in a surplus and I had much more steady and consistent both weight gain and I would say better body comp outcomes during the time when I stopped tracking, which makes sense when you think about being in periods where you're maybe not even in a surplus, but hitting targets, and then going into unnecessarily large surpluses when you go through periods of being like super sedentary, but you're
Yeah.
still hitting this arbitrary number that's kind of based on like your big picture average TDEE, you know? So yeah, those are like the three main benefits I saw is stop being resentful of friends and family, even though I would keep it to myself. Then not being stressed when traveling, and then noticing actually better quality of muscle gain. But um, a big thing I want to talk about, but first I want to kind of hear about it more from the clinician's perspective on your side, is another benefit of, or maybe not even benefit, but basically how you use it. I noticed that tracking supplanted behavior change for me. I guess it is a behavior in and of itself, tracking, but it was basically um, removing the development or preventing the development of certain behaviors that I have now back in the day, that would have made my whole career much easier for that period. So that's something I'm going to drop that seed and we'll let it grow. But anyway, back to you. Tell me a little bit more about you as like an RD and a nutrition coach, how the whole getting away from tracking has played out. Because I find that actually a little harder. It's easier to apply to myself than it is when I'm coaching someone else. And like, I feel like I need data. It took me longer to adopt for my clients than it did for myself.
I think honestly, just one of the biggest things is like when I think about when I learned to track, like no one even told me about hunger sensations or fullness sensations. No one even told me that I should be paying any attention to that. It was just like, here are these numbers and just go hit these numbers. And that was my whole focus was like, let me be precise with my tracking and let me make sure I'm being super precise with my intake. And that was it. And so I guess just now knowing all that, we know now, even when I work with someone, even from the very beginning, we're paying attention to hunger and fullness. So it's like, even when we track, it's like, just because of that awareness I have now, it's like, it's not just tracking to hit these very specific targets, but it's like, I also want you to pay attention to the feedback your body's giving you as you do it. Because what I found too is like, and this is something you're like well aware of as well, is like it's not necessarily like the tracking that actually causes the decreased attunement to our hunger and fullness sensations. It's the tracking to hit these very specific predetermined targets. It's when
Hmm.
so it's like tracking it of itself. Like I mean, it's it's not a huge deal, but it's like when you're tracking to hit these numbers that are not based off of what currently happened that day, but something you calculated months ago. That's when it kind of becomes a problem. So even, and then I'll kind of jump back to the clinician point of view, but even like personally, like you were talking about how you noticed that you would go through like these different phases where you would gain more body fat or be super hungry, kind of based on the same thing. And I've even noticed that, and you have as well, I'm sure, it's like on a day-to-day basis is like, it's like when you're traveling and you're sitting all day, like before when I was tracking to hit these specific targets, I would like be force feeding myself at the end of the day to hit these numbers. And then there would be other days where I would be super active, but because I had these predetermined targets, I had to like go to bed hungry, even in the
Hmm.
off season. And like that, it just didn't make any sense, but at the time, I wasn't even aware that I should be questioning tracking. It was like
Yeah.
once I learned to track, I didn't even think I had the option to stop tracking. It wasn't even a question that crossed my mind. The only time it actually crossed my mind was at the end of 2016 when I was just burned out. I was like, I have to do something else. I can't do this anymore. But from the moment I
Yeah.
learned, it was like I didn't even know to question that method. I thought I knew this thing now, and I thought that's just how you do things.
Hmm.
But yeah, I guess I just back to the clinician perspective is like from the very beginning, it's paying attention to how you're feeling and the feedback your body's giving you, and kind of like I've talked about on some of the other podcast episodes that I've been on, is like sometimes I will just use tracking without assigning targets. So I may give somebody a fruit target, I may give somebody a vegetable target, and I may give somebody a protein minimum, but I might not give them a calorie target. Or if I give them a calorie target, it's a wide calorie range. I'm talking like 500 calories or something, where it's very loose. And I've noticed huge benefits from that, especially if it's someone who already has kind of some habits in place that support their goals, and B, they have a high level of motivation to actually, let's say, lose weight. Because if their motivation is high, then even a little bit of structure is enough to kind of keep them on point. They don't need like a crazy amount of structure and like need to be super precise, if that makes sense.
That makes a ton of sense. And I think we should be clear, like neither one of us are against tracking. It's almost that we had a very dichotomous black and white, I would say even blunt and not very well thought through way of using tracking back in the day as a community, because I think we were just products of that. We're just products of environment. It's everyone else's fault. But I think that was the problem, not tracking in and of itself, because now we're talking about using tracking as a tool that actually helps you. So I think, so for example, I was comfortable, like let's say maybe a year or 2 years ago, saying how I didn't think tracking should be used. And then I've been working on developing more articulate explanations of how I use tracking in a way that wasn't the way we did it before. So I think what we did wrong was essentially, like you were saying, tracking isn't the problem. It's paying no attention to, ignoring, or discounting the value in your hunger and satiety, right? Which arguably, when you think about it, if you're well fine-tuned to it and you're following true hunger and satiety signals, not just like cravings, is probably the best ability we have built in after a lot of years of refinement in these mammalian biological systems we call our bodies, to actually maintain an awareness of where energy balance is. You know, like I'm tracking my step count lately, did that through prep, and it's kind of behavior I'm looking at now. And it varies wildly based on what I do day to day. And that's not even all of NEAT. So I know that I have pretty big disparities in my energy expenditure day to day. And I notice my hunger levels and my satiety levels are quite different, depending on days where I'm either more or less active, for one. And then the second thing I notice is that if I am focusing purely on numbers, I am actively trying to avoid thinking about my hunger and satiety, like whatever, that doesn't matter, you know? So like those two things hand in hand were more so the problem, in that before there was a replacement of hunger and satiety with tracking, which is the issue, not tracking in itself. And what you're saying is, hey, we might have kind of like a baseline minimum for certain things that I want there to be, and then a level of flex based on how hungry you are. So it's incorporating the two. One is actually helping the other, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, because it's like it allows you to even be, whether we're talking about getting away from tracking or even incorporating your hunger and fullness sensations with your tracking, it allows you to actually, like, even if you are tracking, it allows you to be more, I guess, I don't know, probably the right word is not effective, but that whatever intake you're at, like if you're dieting and your intake is limited, then if you're paying attention to how you're feeling, you can be more strategic with when you eat. Whereas like if you're not paying attention to anything, then you're kind of just following some standardized guidelines or just some stuff that's, again, it's all coming from the outside of you. But if you're paying attention, it just allows you to be more strategic, so you can control, your hunger better, even when you are tracking.
Yeah, exactly. So to me, it's like what you don't want to do with tracking is remove this very useful system you have of getting a gauge of maybe what your energy expenditure is and how large your surplus or your deficit is, and just follow the numbers blindly. But tracking has a number of very useful roles, which is like ensuring accuracy and making sure some of those big rocks are in place that are useful for, say, body composition, performance, or health and lifestyle, like ensuring you get X number of fruit, water, fiber, vegetables, protein, etc. That's something I wrote about in the blog post, The Default Diet, like saying, hey, here's what should always be in place. Here's your structure. Here for a bodybuilder, we have protein plus all the other things I mentioned. That's always there. And then based on your goal, we can add portion sizes of fats and carbs based on what phase of your nutrition you're in. And that, someone could read that and go, right, I just changed my numbers I hit. But I'd say probably better than that is to have, a flexibility in those ranges based on your hunger signals, especially in the off season. Another thing that I really like tracking for, which you mentioned earlier, was that you have people track but not necessarily hit targets. And I think it's initially a really good educational tool and at times a really good quote unquote nutritional auditing tool. Like a lot of the strategies we're talking about, we're using tracking as an adjunct, requires someone to have those skills of knowing how to weigh food, track food, read nutrition labels, and to understand what leads to satiety, what might lead towards getting a higher protein, carbohydrate, or fat intake, and having basic nutritional, awareness and literacy, which I think tracking is a, not to say the same word twice, tracking is a fast track towards developing those skills. And I think some of the best things you can do with someone to start out is just have them track what they're already doing. And then they can be like, oh, I see how my behaviors have led to this outcome. And then also where they could be modified and what assumptions I might have had that were wrong. Like, oh, I was having, trail mix, so I'd have more energy and get protein in when I would go on my hikes or something like that. But that's actually low in protein, really high in fat, and doesn't have much carbs. And maybe that's not the best choice for me. Maybe I should have a protein bar and fruit or something like that, et cetera. So I think that's probably one of the best uses of it.
Yeah. Well, because like since we're talking about kind of like how we use tracking now, is like if I look at let's say all the people that I work with and am currently working with and have worked with, like most of them, if they haven't already, like where we start is a period of tracking. So it's like I still use tracking, and normally at the very beginning as a tool to help them gain that awareness of food, awareness of their current habits, and also so that way they can have kind of an idea of where their calorie intake needs to be. Because like like you're saying, you just learn so much through the process of tracking that's kind of where I normally start people if they've never tracked before. Again, like I said, how precise I want them to be depends on the person and their goals, but we typically always start off with like a period of at least some sort of tracking. Mm-hmm. And then, I lost my second point there, but
so that's all good. I think that bridges nicely to something I wanted to say is essentially there's kind of two different ways I approach it when I work with people or when I give advice to certain people is especially with 3DMJ, you're going to be in one of two camps. We have our biweekly, like twice a month check-ins that we have now, and also our Skype consultations, and we have like our contest prep where we're working with competitors in either powerlifting or bodybuilding most of the time, and they often come to the table with different needs, goals, and we have different assumptions, and they often have a different kind of average characteristic of what their experience with this is. So we have the more general pop, if you will, who come to us with less nutritional awareness, potentially never having tracked, and not having done this before or really having many established habits. And then we also have the competitors on the other side who maybe have been tracking for a long time. And what we end up doing to help them get to where they need to go is quite different between the two. So for example, when someone comes to me who's never tracked before, doesn't have those skills, the first step is to have them track, but not with any targets. However, when I get someone who's been tracking like you or I were for years, and wants to get away from it, it's a very different process of where we might want to go and the conversations we have. And I think that's interesting, is that tracking is something you might be transitioning away from as early as possible in the case of the competitor. Let's say if they're in the off season and they were like you or I, and we've identified and convinced them of certain positives. While on the other hand, tracking is a tool used to develop some habits and some education in the more general pop person. So I find that's just a very interesting paradigm along the spectrum of how tracking could be used based on the client you're dealing with.
Yeah. Well, and even like you're saying there, like, because I've been wrestling with that as well. It's like, okay, well, what do I want to call tracking? Do I want to call it a tool? Do I want to call it a process? Because it's like, it all depends on the context, like what you frame it as. And like, I see it as an approach to be used, but then I also see it as like, if we're talking about sustainable behavior change, I see it as like normal is not tracking And then we only use tracking when necessary to kind of like redirect and help set up their lifestyle to support their health and goals. But then we get out of tracking, when we don't need it. So it's like that's kind of how I'm kind of framed it as well. It's like normal is not tracking. And then you only use tracking like when you need to help like redirect things and set up new habits. But then once those are set up, you just go back to your kind of your new normal and discontinue tracking.
Yeah, I love the way you said it's a new normal, because the goal for pretty much everybody, and it's just slightly different for competitors, is to have your automatic be what supports your goals, right? So people come to us from the general pop category when that is not the case. What I'm currently doing is not working. I looked up one day and I'm just unhappy with my body, or I got a health checkup and I'm unhealthy, or et cetera, et cetera. Something has changed in my life, and I need to figure out how to change what I'm currently doing. And then tracking is used as almost like turning on radar, so you know what the situation is, and then as a way to go, okay, here's the things we identify that we need to change, and then it may or may not be a tool used to modify those things, which I think is really cool. And sometimes it's just helping people make new decisions, develop new habits, and then go back to those same basic strategies of just living life. But now it's okay. Now we're living life with certain meal times. Now we're living life with certain different decisions as options for what foods we're going to grab when we are hungry. But we're still eating when we're hungry, or and stopping when we're full. That kind of thing. An interesting thing that I think is happening more and more often as people get engaged with bodybuilding early, because of now being exposed to it via social media at an earlier stage, and now that like tracking apps and the idea of if it fits your macros are so ubiquitous, is that a lot of people get into bodybuilding, and this didn't happen earlier back in the day. I think we were probably like maybe the first generation this happened to, maybe me, because I think you might be a little bit later than I was, but like myself, Berto, and a few other folks who got into bodybuilding in the mid 2000s, we were kind of like the first generation who may have got into bodybuilding before we really had much of a fitness lifestyle. Typically if you go back into the 90s, before the internet was big, and a lot of the folks I knew who came up before me, is they were a fit person, and they went, oh, bodybuilding might be a good thing for me to do. And they already had this kind of lifestyle established, and it was less of a modification to go into prep. They were already eating things like chicken, rice, and broccoli, reading Flex magazine, and exposed to the bodybuilding culture to some degree before they became a competitor. But for me, I had 2 years of lifting under my belt, and then was thinking about competitive bodybuilding. But I came from the skinny, like, video game playing, early 20s, no nutritional skills background. So like for me, my quote unquote fitness lifestyle was essentially just the seafood diet, eating a high protein diet and eating everything and trying to gain weight and lift. And the first time I actually had nutritional structure was contest prep. And that was shortly after I got exposed to If It Fits Your Macros. So the only real structure I had was numbers. So I had been used to ignoring my hunger signals and my satiety signals because I had to gain weight and I was force feeding. And then I switched to ignoring my hunger signals and satiety signals because I needed to get shredded. And the only constancy was that, okay, now I'm hitting numbers. That was the change, quote unquote, for my life. So when I finished my 07 season, now it's very obvious to me why I had such a disastrous postseason, because I had nothing to fall back on. I had no established behaviors. I had no nutritional literacy outside of just really knowing what foods had certain macros in them. While I look at other people, they were living kind of like the physical culture lifestyle, and then they decided to go on the branch of bodybuilding, and they might have had a bad blowout post-comp and, struggled with the fact that they were less lean than when they were just, into physical culture kind of in general, post-season. They kind of had some overshoot, but man, I got fat so quick, and I just had no concept. And it took me to stop tracking to actually develop nutritional habits that were useful. And so it's such a late development of a skill, but I think that's much more common these days, that people think bodybuilding nutrition is tracking macros and hitting them and making sure they get a certain protein. Like it's basically numbers. How do I define my nutritional habits? Well, if I'm in CrossFit, it'll be different numbers than if I'm in bodybuilding or what have you. But so it's this. I think that's a problem. Like numbers aren't habits, and that can result in, depending on your personality, some people might just gravitate towards, right, I'm just going to cook everything on Sunday, hit these numbers, and I have these really, really well established routines. But other people, they have a different culinary experience each time they step up to the plate based on what's around, or they're freestyling it or what have you. And while that's a good skill to be able to be anywhere, anything with any foods and hit numbers, it's not necessarily the same as having these fallback habits, because I had no normal, which is what we're talking about. So that was a problem. And it took me getting rid of tracking to then develop, like, oh, what's my routine? What do I do every day? What foods do I include? And then noticing that, okay, I'm eating based on my hunger and satiety, and developing that awareness. And it's almost like I did it backwards. But I think that's more common among bodybuilders who come to us, especially with those of a younger generation. And then it's totally the opposite with Gen Pop, where they've just been eating and living life in the obesogenic environment we have in the West. And then, tracking is not the problem, but it's actually the first step in a number of solutions to changing it, which is just an interesting to how I don't think most practitioners, especially coming from kind of the bodybuilding community, realize how completely polar opposite the approaches should be. And I think that's why they sometimes really do a disservice to like the non-bodybuilder community.
Yeah, and my experience was the same thing you just described. It was when I was tracking, it was my whole focus was on hitting those numbers, but I never really developed any habits. And it was not until I got away from tracking that I really started looking at like, okay, how do I actually build a meal? Like, I don't know, it was just like such a simple concept where it's like before it was like as long as I still, like, even when I was tracking, I kind of ate the same foods at about the same times, but I didn't really think about building meals. It was just how can I hit these targets by the end of the day? And I also kind of eat at these times. Where it's like now it's like, okay, like let me just build my meals around protein, fruits, and vegetables. And like doing that gets me so far. So it's like you're saying, like as a practitioner now, it's like even when we're tracking at the same time, I'm having them develop a flexible eating routine where they just get in the habit of building their meals around protein, fruits, and vegetables. And then one thing that does is then when we do transition away, it makes the process so easy. Like, I mean, it's at this point now where it's like, I mean, when we do transition away, I mean, it's a matter of like sometimes within a week, they're already comfortable with it. Like there's almost always, not always, but there's almost always some anxiety around getting away from tracking. When somebody's been tracking for a long period of time, and I was the same way, it's like I made all this progress, and the way that I made this progress was tracking. Tracking works, so, and I don't mind it a ton, so like, why don't I just stick with it? And it's like with then as a practitioner, just trust me, like let's get away from it. They're always so relieved once they actually do, and it doesn't take very long. Like I said, sometimes if we've been doing all the other stuff kind of like leading into that, within the first week they already feel comfortable with it, and they're just like, man, like this is so amazing. Like thank you for telling me to get away from tracking, But it's like it's one of those things that like I think we have to actually experience to really feel that. So that is one of the things I've noticed is like doing what you're talking about, not just having the numbers, but also focusing on like the bigger picture habits. Like it allows for an easier transition away from tracking.
Yeah, and the research, even there's some cool qualitative research that lines up with that. There's this paper called "Learning to Eat Again," and it's these qualitative interviews with these female ex-athletes, or they're athletes in university, and how they had been eating a certain way based on their coach or what they believe they had to do for their sport. But in general, they're eating for performance, and they had these structures imposed that in many cases supplanted their hunger or satiety. They had to eat a lot for performance in some cases. Sometimes it was they're eating just a lot all the time because they was running away from them. And in other cases, it was I was staying light and always being in a state of restraint so I could keep a low, power to weight ratio. So on both ends of the spectrum, which is interesting, the commonality was not paying attention to hunger and satiety. And they all experienced this initial phase of weight regain or gaining weight, and being unhappy with it, feeling out of control, not knowing how to prevent it. But they through that process had to figure out, and like the title says, learn to eat again. And once they did that, the sense of relief, better enjoyment of life, and kind of this light at the end of the tunnel. But I think it does require some proof being in the pudding. That pudding being you eat until you're satiated, but you have to figure out where that is. It takes that kind of like, oh, I'm not gaining weight, oh, I'm not getting fat, or I'm struggling with this, but I know it's worth it because the alternative was something that burned me out, and now I've kind of figured it out. And I think that's something that is a tougher sell with bodybuilders, and you can't transition as far away from, I'm not going to say tracking macros, but tracking something with bodybuilders to the same extent, or with powerlifters for that example as well, as you can Gen Pop, because they've always got a performance related goal that's either tied to a weight class or tied to what is probably optimal for off-season goals. So for example, if we know we should be in a small surplus a fair amount of our off-season, we probably want to be at least checking our body weight every now and again. And then that might change your behavior, So like if we're, just as an example, like I might instruct the bodybuilder in the off season who's fully bought into this whole no tracking thing, like, hey, I want you to be full after each meal, and they go, sweet, I can do that. And we're chucking along, and they kind of hit a plateau. They're not looking more muscular to me. Their numbers aren't going up. We do nutritional audit, and we find out, okay, let's get you back on the scale. Let's track your macros. And we find that you've gotten so full that your calories have actually come down. Your body weight has dropped a kilo and stayed there. And now we're probably in like this kind of maintenance-y slight deficit because you're so tired of eating. Now we're going to have to actually track to enforce the surplus, or maybe do a mini cut, or potentially just get you to recalibrate what being full after a meal is. It might be, okay, now you need to be uncomfortably full. It needs to be like, use the rating systems that you've talked about before. Instead of a 4 out of 5 fullness, we actually need to be a 5 out of 5 fullness after each one of your meals to get you where you need to be. Or we need to recalibrate and choose different foods that have a higher energy density that aren't so filling, so that you can have the same level of fullness but get in more calories. So I find that's something you have to do a lot more with athletes, because it's not purely based on where they would get to with kind of their behavioral homeostasis. It's based on, we want to find a homeostasis that results in our performance goals being achieved. So I think that's probably, I find that the distance away from, tracking on some degree that a bodybuilder or a powerlifter gets is never quite as far as Gen Pop, where basically you're just trying to get them to have, lifestyle related changes to their new normal that permanently result in them having a healthy body composition. So yeah, I don't know how often you work with athletes and where you just can't quite push them as far, or if you have unique strategies that differ between those two population camps.
Well, I would add to, I agree with everything you said, and I would add to that, when you're talking about like somebody who has performance related goals, is one way that I have helped people like kind of recalibrate. If we noticed, like, for example, like was working with someone, our goal was to maintain weight. And initially we were tracking, and I was like, hey, we're good. Like, you're maintaining your weight, performance is good. Like, we don't need to track anymore. Like, let's just track, protein feedings, servings of fruit, servings of vegetables, and just keep your same habits in place. We did that for a while, and like the scale started trickling down. And after a few weeks, it started affecting their performance. So what we did then is like, okay, let's bring tracking back in, but let's just do it 3 days per week. So like that's a strategy that I've used to help recalibrate people. It's like, we don't have to swing back from like 0 days of tracking to now 7 days of tracking, but let's just track fully for 3 days and track some of those habits or like total nutrition targets on the other days. And just even doing that, adding back in just a couple of days per tracking per week, can help recalibrate with having to get like fully back into it. Because if I think about also another example of somebody kind of on my roster right now, is they want to continue to lose weight, but they're extremely burned out on tracking. And so like we started off with tracking, making good progress, and they were still making good progress. It's just, they were like, can we do something else? Like, I'm just tired of tracking. And so now it's like we have them tracking certain nutrition targets and certain behaviors and have gotten away from tracking, but we still are doing things like monitoring the scale and monitoring their performance to make sure things are going the way they want to. But that I guess just touches on back to kind of the beginning of the conversation of, when you're tracking, also developing that skill of being able to recognize your hunger and fullness sensations, so that way you have other options if you don't want to track anymore, versus if the only skill I've developed is tracking, then I'm kind of screwed. So I found it gives you another approach, it gives you another option, and I've seen it play out, like I said, with myself and with clients, and it works really well. And so maybe even like segueing or from that is like, I'm not even kind of just reading lists off, but like maybe just giving, because if I think back to some of the videos that I put out on the 3DMJ channel, a lot of the conversation was around, okay, well, how, like, we're kind of learning to recognize, okay, we're talking about almost these ambiguous things right now, hunger sensations, fullness sensations, but we really haven't gotten specific for what that is. So if nobody knows what we're talking about, it's like, it's really no help. If we end this podcast and don't actually go through examples, okay, well, what are some hunger sensations? Like, what does hunger feel like to you? What does it feel like to me? What does it feel like when we're satisfied? I feel like it might be helpful to go through that versus just leaving it arbitrary and ambiguous, like hunger and fullness sensations.
Absolutely. Go into it, brother.
Yeah. So I would say, hunger is going to feel different for different people. Like I'm sure, like between you and me, there's probably some similarities. There's probably some sensations that we both experience. But then if we think about a basic Venn diagram, there's probably also sensations that just you experience and just I experience. So if I think about some of the most common hunger sensations, it is difficulty concentrating. It is stomach pain. It is burning sensation in the stomach, bubbling in the stomach, just a general weakness, lightheadedness, dizziness. It could be, I probably got a list right here.
Food focus is one that
Yeah.
and I find one for me is food focus that's not related to, like, food focus that sneaks up on me. So this is something that I've had to kind of get some granularity around, because I'm only 4 weeks post competition. So like food focus is kind of just a thing. So I have food focus from planning my meals and tracking, which I started doing towards the last half of my prep to make sure that I actually got into the kind of condition I wanted. And then I obviously dealt with a great deal of hunger as I got really, really lean, and it takes time for that to dissipate. But I notice now there's a difference between, like, if I have free time on my hands and I'm not necessarily hungry, I will start thinking about food. And I know that's just because I am post-comp and I've been very, very food focused. My body wants me to eat. And I know that's kind of my hormonal state, but it's not necessarily indicative of like my energy status, However, if I'm like in the middle of this podcast right now and I'm talking to you, I'm doing things, I'm writing a paper, I'm like, posting on social media, I'm talking with my students, and I keep getting distracted by my subconscious and food starts coming up, that often is something how I can differentiate between, food preoccupation that is due to idle hands and idle mind of a post-contest bodybuilder versus I'm actually hungry. And I notice it often coincides with those other symptoms of hunger that maybe I'm less aware of. Like, it's funny for me, like if I'm really in the midst of working, I will not notice my body's hunger signals, but I will get like my focus will get worse. I'm like, God, what's going on? I'm like, oh, I'm actually hungry. If I stop, then that makes me stop working, and then I notice, oh, I'm hungry and lethargic. So yeah, I think those are good ones. But yeah, if you've got more, read them off.
Yeah, I got a couple more, and then I'm going to piggyback on that because I'm similar. But just to go through the list again, because I kind of stopped halfway. But lightheadedness, dizziness, difficulty concentrating, headache, just general irritability, growling noises in your stomach, bubbling in your stomach, stomach pain, and general weakness. So just some general hunger sensations. And again, like not everyone's going to experience all of those things. But that's where it just comes down to kind of knowing yourself. But just kind of piggybacking off of what you said is I'm the same way. It's, I'm doing something, and then for me, it's my concentration is one of the first things I notice is and it's not so much that I get spacey, but I just get stuck on stuff where it's like I'm spending way too long on some minor detail. I'm just like agonizing over how I'm going to structure some sentence. And like, I have to like break myself out of that. If not, I'll spend like 30 minutes like trying to like restructure this thing. And if I just can get out of that, I'll realize I'm just hungry. Like, so that's one of the biggest ways that I know. And that's like, even like kind of, I think I talked about it in the last podcast, and I know there's that video on your channel of the Hunger-Fullness Scale, being like, it's a good tool for, kind of learning what different levels of hunger and fullness feel like to you. But eventually those numbers fall away, and you just get so attuned to those sensations that, if you and I are sitting here and we're talking, it's not that, I'm also rating, okay, once I get to a 3, then I'm going to go eat something. I just noticed that, I probably wouldn't do it in the middle of our conversation, but, after this conversation, I just would feel the drop in performance, and then I would go eat.
Really quick favor, guys. If you enjoy these shows and have been a listener for quite some time, we would really, really, really appreciate it if you could take the time to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your preferred podcast app may be. Having lots of ratings and audience feedback makes our show become more visible across multiple platforms, and it supports our mission of helping as many people as we can to be the best athletes, coaches, and lifting enthusiasts that they could possibly be. So if you're not driving and wouldn't be dangerous, pause this thing right now and give us an honest review over on your podcast app, and we would love you even more than we already do. Thanks for taking the time, and we hope you enjoy the show.
I also think it's useful to, and sometimes it's not intuitive like in research, we have a satiety scale and we have a hunger scale that are often used. And I think sometimes we only think about it as either I'm hungry or I'm not, or I'm full or I'm not, but there are actually different sensations, I find, and they go away or come back at different times. One interesting thing about prep that I found is that hunger would go away, but fullness becomes a sensation that kind of just goes on vacation at a certain point in prep and never comes back. Like I noticed that the best case scenario was not being hungry, but feeling satisfied at a meal, if that's something that you're used to, which I find a lot of people, that's kind of, for people who have like whether they're in the military and you're supposed to eat everything in front of you no matter what and fast, or if you came from a family where you're supposed to clean your plate, like your experience of fullness is that bloated, uncomfortable kind of Thanksgiving post-meal feeling, and if that's what you're used to, that sensation pretty much is gone during prep and doesn't come back for a while. You can feel bloated, but you don't actually feel that satisfied, like your body's like, hey, you're done. You've hit your bliss point. Good food doesn't taste good anymore. Like at a certain point in prep, good food keeps tasting good, despite the fact that you've got food backed up into your esophagus, and that was an interesting experience for me, is to become aware of when maybe my hunger signals might dissipate. Like I'm not hungry, but I don't feel full. And when they don't coincide, it can lead to cravings taking over and you not being able to differentiate the difference between hunger and cravings. And I think that's something that people struggle a lot with. How do you help people differentiate between a craving and actual hunger?
I mean, there's a few ways. One of the biggest things, and again, it kind of just goes back to that Hunger-Fullness Scale, and maybe it'd be helpful if I went through that, but it's just learning to, again, like just first off, you have to be aware of kind of what your hunger sensations are, but then also it's being aware of like your current emotional state. That's a big one. So I found that like most cravings you don't typically get cravings when you're excited, or, when you're in a peaceful state of mind. Like you typically don't, get cravings then. It's typically when you're like lonely or sad or angry or frustrated. So it's
bored.
being able, or bored. So it's being aware of your own emotional state and trying to block that out and just focus on those physical sensations that I just went through, to help you differentiate between the two. And also it's like, I found as well as there's kind of a time component. So let's say I just start working with someone and they've had some eating habits where they eat a lot of like sugary food or fatty food, and they're just used to eating a certain way. Like as we know, like your taste will change, your palate will change over time. You just kind of got to get through that period. So what I tell people is, because the common question is, will I have to fight these cravings forever? Will I always crave this junk food and this and that? And, there's a few ways I could answer that, but, simply is no. Like, for one, your palate changes, and like pretty soon, because I think about it, like I remember one time I was working with a guy, and like he was somebody who used to eat a bunch of junk food, and then one day we got on a call for a weekly consultation, and he was just like, man, I had the most amazing oranges this week. They were so incredible. He's like, they're caras, you got to try them, man. And I was just like, it's hilarious, because like, I mean, he's talking about oranges like they were wedding cake or something. And it's just like, it just shows how much, his palate had changed, and also like being in a deficit also makes food taste better. But like, it's just showing how much his palate had changed. Another thing that I kind of tell people as well is like, not only do you get cravings less, physiologically, but also like psychologically, you start to like really love what's going on, the process. Like, you love how you're feeling, you love how you look. Like, it's easier to say no. Like, it's like maybe you're still getting pulled in two directions, to have the junk food and also to kind of stay on track with what you want to do. But that pull towards the junk food gets less and less and less as you start to see and experience the benefits of this new lifestyle more. So I'd say those are two of the biggest things that make the decision easier and easier through time. Your palate changing, and also you just get pulled stronger towards this new lifestyle because you love it, and you're seeing and experiencing all the benefits. Where before it's like, somebody we've all, more energy, more mental clarity, all these benefits to like living a healthy lifestyle. But until we actually live that lifestyle, they're just words, they're just phrases.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny how I think a lot of those, like I really, like in the off season, once I developed all these habits and I got away from tracking, I just felt better about myself. Like, I was like, damn it, I'm an athlete, I'm a bodybuilder. When like my breakfast would be, sauteed spinach, roasted tomato, and a couple of slices of bread with poached eggs and smoked salmon. I'm like, dude, I hit my macros, and I had a piece of fruit later for like, I'm crushing it. It makes me feel, it's almost like you completed the workout. Like you've done your homework. You're being a good bodybuilder. It makes you feel like you're part of the community. You're reaching your goals. It gives you these little wins each time, which I think when I was fully, if it fits your macros, the only way to get the win was hit the target numbers, which made me not pay attention to these other really useful signals, which gave me only one binary option to win, which is super black and white for something that's supposed to be flexible dieting, so it's actually not. And, and so there's definitely some other components to it that allow you to make those decisions more easily. And then it's funny now, as I've gone through prep, and I have like competing signals. So like now it's interesting. And this speaks to how it's not about should you not track or track, and is it good or bad, but having much more granularity around understanding these as tools. Not tracking, transitioning away from tracking, is used as a tool as well. So for example, the way I am doing it now is I only track if I'm feeling anxious and I want to quantify what I'm eating to feel like, okay, I haven't eaten too crazy. Like, so essentially I like to feel like a bodybuilder, like I'm eating healthy, I'm doing those things. But sometimes, like right now, my palate has changed because I'm post-comp. And I just want to go get donuts, and like, I don't care. And the part of me that goes, but don't you want to feel like a bodybuilder? That's probably too much food, or, like there's the voice in me that thinks that's not a good thing. But the other part of me is I feel restrained if I listen to that. So I kind of have to listen to both voices and go, right. So post-comp right now, I don't want to feel restrained. I've been restraining myself since January, and it's August. It's September, excuse me. What month are we? I don't know. So I try to basically listen to my hunger and satiety signals, but if I have a voice in me that really wants donuts or pizza or ice cream, then I listen to it, which is unique, even though I might be, not hungry, and I feel, and then I'm kind of assessing, all right, will I still feel like a bodybuilder? Is that going to bother me? And like, where's the least amount of mental stress? What's the pathway forward? And then evaluating my goals and kind of trying to make this this eventual decision that incorporates both tracking and considering my level of hunger and fullness, and then trying to then objectively stand back and go, okay, what's reasonable? So it's actually, I wouldn't be able to make the same decisions if I only used one or the other. Yeah. If I was just tracking, like let's say, okay, I'm doing the recovery diet and I'm eating 3,800 calories a day. That's it. Boom, period, whatever. And then we adjust it based on weight gain or weight loss. And if I was not tracking at all, I might actually have a higher level of anxiety because I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't normally eat donuts. I should figure out how much these calories in donuts are because, there's so much higher in energy density, and I can't trust my hunger and satiety signals, but I can't track because tracking's bad. Like, it would cause me more anxiety. But having both tools available to me allows me to go, okay, I can self-soothe. That was actually only a 300 calorie cookie. It was a big cookie, but how much can be packed into a cookie? Okay, 300 calories, cool. So I'm still below my max target for the day. All right, so do I feel restrained? Do I feel satiated? Yeah, I got to have a cookie. That's cool. There's always cookies tomorrow if I want it. Let's finish the day. But some of those options would be off the table without having the awareness of both. So I think that's really important, just that people understand it's not like, oh, should I track or not, but rather how can it be used as a useful tool, whichever one you're emphasizing, and at different times. Because I went through prep for the first 8 weeks not tracking at all, still kind of knowing where I was at, but keeping myself kind of slightly hungry, and then having refeeds and making sure I hit protein and vegetable targets and fruit targets. And then started to track at a certain point because I felt too anxious not to. And I knew that I was dealing with ever decreasing total numbers. So small variances could, shut down my deficit. So it's definitely the case of adding another tool to your belt and knowing when to use it, and understanding that you may have a case where you're going to use a screwdriver and a hammer, to fix the same problem.
And I would love to hear your experience. I know I experienced this a ton, and I've heard it a lot from clients. So I'm curious to hear what you say. Is when I was tracking and the only thing I knew was these predetermined targets, then those numbers would affect my eating behaviors. Like, there could be times when I was not hungry at all. And then all of a sudden I would look at my MyFitnessPal and I would see like, oh shoot, I've only had 900 calories today. And then all of a sudden, like, my brain would start going, and that would affect my physiology. And now all of a sudden I would be eating, but it's just like, had I never looked at MyFitnessPal, I'd have been good. But because I looked at those numbers, that got in my head, that affected my physiology, and then that affected my behavior. And I found that with me, and I've heard that feedback from a lot of clients, is like, those numbers can then, it's almost like, if I know I have $500 in my bank account, I'm going to spend the $500. And did you find that as well? It's like, just knowing you had more, all of a sudden, like, turn everything on to where it's like it made you hungrier?
100%. And it's no different than you feeling totally fine and then walking by a donut shop or McDonald's and smelling their fries or whatever you think of. Like, I was good to go, and then I smelled that pizza, or I smelled that popcorn, or I heard the song from the fairgrounds, and now all of a sudden I want like a fried Snickers bar or whatever. And all the memory and sensory cues that we have, when you've tracked macros, you associate certain meals, foods, and levels of fullness and satiety and experiences with numbers. So when you see the numbers, it cues those same sensory signals and therefore behaviors. So it is absolutely, I think 100% have experienced that. It's no different. And where I really noticed it was actually early on in prep, and then also in 2018, I did 2 mini cuts where I did not track. I mini cut in April and I mini cut in October, and all I did was stop eating out and just eating at home and having like fruits and vegetables and protein bars in place of eating out. And I would occasionally audit just to be like, I wonder how much I'm eating, because I was losing weight quickly. I was like dropping 2 pounds a week easily, without even feeling hungry at all. And I'd be like, whoa, I ate 1,600 calories today. Like, I hit my protein target and it was all fruits and vegetables. But when you track 1,600 calories, you convince yourself it's too little, you're hungry, you should be eating more. Like, no, my targets are 2,000 on this mini cut, etc. But man, it was effortless hitting of super low days sometimes, because I just didn't need to eat more. Like I was satiated. I was fine. Like I had a body fat level that was pretty high, and I'd had mostly very filling foods. I got my micronutrients in, I got my protein in, and you had a 94 kilo male eating 1,600 calories, not hungry. But when I track that, it's a very different experience.
Yeah.
So 100%, that's where I noticed it. And I think that that's a really good experience for people to have, in that you can actually do cuts and weight gain periods without tracking. That's one thing, is like, it's not just for maintenance. I don't think it's appropriate for certain goals, or maybe it's not the best tool at certain times. But yeah, I don't think I'll track on future mini cuts ever again. Because I know what it looks like. It's just like, all right, so it's fruits and vegetables and lean protein, and if I'm really hungry, then I'll have a day where I'm hungry, and that's okay. So it's kind of it's this interesting experience where tracking becomes part of your sensory experience, because you associate numbers with things. So that very much is the case. I think it can, like what Berto introduced the phrase quantifying your suffering, which I really like. Like when people say I'm on poverty macros, like clearly they have a judgment about what their macros are. And it's not based on necessarily, because like if the macros are reasonable and they're assigned by a coach and they're resulting in a certain amount of weight loss, they're appropriate for you. Yet you're labeling them poverty, But man, I can tell you from talking to hundreds of competitors that there's guys who diet on 400 grams of carbs, and there's guys who diet on 150 grams of carbs. There's gals who diet on 400 grams of carbs who weigh way less than you'd think that'd be possible. But they all start suffering at a certain point, even though the numbers might look monstrous. And it's kind of like the same thing. Like when I squatted 495, it probably felt just as hard as Ray Williams squatting 1,000, Mm-hmm. The relative difficulty and, like injury risk and the work that we had to put in to get there, in either case, despite these totally different external numbers, was a similar experience, But once we start looking at it, I can feel shitty about squatting 495 because everyone on my Instagram feed is cracking 600, because I follow, the USAPL's greatest hits kind of thing. And same kind of thing can happen if you're following people who are all about that if it fits your macros lifestyle. Now all of a sudden you're looking at your macros and, these are poverty macros. But are they? Like, they're plenty for your energy. You're still getting, if it's their well-designed diet, you're getting in all the nutrients you need and everything. And if you weren't tracking it, you probably feel fine. Just like I was during that mini cut when I had 1,600 calories. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Like I woke up and I had, eggs on toast, some fruit. And then I had a protein bar before I trained. I had a protein shake afterwards, and then I had a salad for dinner, and then Greek yogurt before bed. Like I just ate. It's all good. I ate diet or like clean foods, but oh shit, that's only 1,600 calories. And maybe I was a little hungry the next day, and I ate 1,900. But in the end, like I'm dropping like the max rate of weight loss speed that's fine, and my performance is good. Like shit.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm like struggling in my head because there's two like major ways I want to take this, but I guess I'll start and I'm just going to continue with that one. It's just like picking off of that point that leads to, okay, because I saw this in the comment sections as well, is that is one of the fears about transitioning away, is what if I get so far away that it actually affects my performance? And so like one of the ways that I kind of talked about that was, this is called, transitioning away from tracking. So it's like this whole conversation, there's an assumption that like it's for people who have tracked before, which means they know a ton about food. They have the ability to estimate calorie intakes. They're already consuming a high protein diet. They already have habits in place that support their goals. It also means they know roughly how many calories they need to consume to gain weight, to lose weight, or to maintain their weight. So it's like this whole conversation is based on people who have already tracked, who already have all this knowledge and who already have all these habits in place, so they can easily get a gauge of where they're at. They have that, plus, like we've already kind of alluded to, is you also have some objective things in place to ensure that you're achieving the outcomes you want to, whether it's tracking body weight, physique pictures, tracking your training, clothes, measurements, whatever that is. But it's like this conversation is not how to lose weight if you've never tracked before. It's how to transition away from tracking. So I just noticed that was like, moving forward, it's like you use all of that stuff that you learned from tracking. You already have those habits in place. You use your goals, and then you incorporate your hunger and fullness sensations. You add that new element, and you use all of those things to help you make your decisions moving forward. So it's not like you have no information, or you're going to forget everything, or all your habits are going to fall apart. Like, we're saying that you do this stuff once you already have these habits in place. And one thing I always tell people is, just because you're transitioning away from tracking, that doesn't necessarily mean you're changing anything about reality and how you're eating or what you're eating. All you're doing is not writing it down anymore. But you might not be changing anything about what you're actually doing. It's just you're not writing it down. I don't know. I think that's one of the ways that I can see where it causes that concern is if I'm not tracking, how am I going to know that I'm in a surplus? Well, one, it's like you have all this stuff in place to help you get to get an idea of whether you're in a surplus. Two, it's like you have some objective measurements, some metrics to let you know. But yeah.
No, I think that's really well said. I think it's just a fear-based response. Like, in people who haven't been paying attention to their nutrition, haven't been paying attention to their hunger and satiety signals, even have been actively avoiding them. Maybe even feel like the only thing that's preventing them from overeating or undereating in the case you gave, or not being quote unquote optimal, is like the only way they get there is tracking, and then they'll gain weight if they don't. That kind of thing. That's one concern, or the fear of missing out on optimality. Those are the two camps that I see where these questions come from: is the super high neuroticism, fear of missing out on optimal. Folks who are like, tracking, I have something to hold on to that's objective, and I know I'm being optimal. In reality, you don't. Like, those are made up numbers. You got it off some nutrition calculator. Or the folks who basically they feel the only thing that's preventing them from being having a physique they don't like, or gaining weight, or slowly sliding towards obesity is tracking. And I think it's very scary for them, and they almost perceive it like being in a strange place they've never been before, and all of a sudden you turn off the lights and you go, okay, you got to find the exit. When in reality, it's probably more like being in your home and nothing's changed, all the furniture's still there, and the lights go out, and you have to make it to your bedroom. And it's not like there's daggers on the wall, like, oh, okay, I was a little closer to the wall than I thought. But then what it's really like, once you find out that it's not even that, is you actually use whole new sensory systems. You realize that before you were in your home with the lights on, but you had your nose plugged, your ears plugged, and you couldn't hear people talking to you. You couldn't smell things. And now you're actually getting a sense of realizing, well, hold on, I actually can't close my eyes, and the lights it's only a dimmer. Like you said, I can't, when I got away from tracking, it would take me about 10 seconds. I wouldn't have to quantify it. I could go through each meal and be a little more precise and think about what I ate. But if I just sat there at, let's say, 6 p.m. and I guessed what my calories were, I think I've had about 2,500 today. And then I went through it, I would be within 10%. So we're talking, maybe I was at 2,800, maybe I was at 2,200, but I was close, And if I actually went through it and tracked it in my head, not even writing it down, I'd be pretty much bang on. And I would always know within probably 10 grams what my protein was. That's something I've always thought about, So it's like, how do you not know, It's more a question of, did I think about it and did I add it up versus am I actually tracking? It's not like you get to the end of the day and you're like, shit, it could have been 1,000 calories, could have been 10,000. I don't know, dog.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree. And like you said, I think sometimes it's personality types. I asked this at one of the conferences I spoke at this year. I was like, someone wasn't really sure what I meant by neuroticism or obsessive compulsive. I'm just doing things optimal. I dot my T's and I cross my I's. People would look at that and say that I'm being obsessive, but I'm just trying to maximize every variable possible. I'm like, here, let me help you. So you track, right? And yes. Okay. So at the end of the day, you have one meal left. Your goal is to hit, 2,500 calories. And before you've had the meal, you've tracked on MyFitnessPal 1,800. So you have 700 calories left. So let me ask you a question. Do you make a 700 calorie meal, eat it, and not track it in MyFitnessPal? so that, if you look back on that day, it'd be 1800, or do you feel off unless you actually enter, that 700 calorie meal into MyFitnessPal? And they looked, and they were like, no, I would definitely enter into MyFitnessPal. And I'd be like, why? Like, that's not optimal. That's obsessive. Like, you feel the need to enter it, even though you ate it and it's going to hit your target. And he was like, well, it would be to look back and know that like, dude, that's not why. Like, stop convincing yourself. Like, you have this obsessive need to track the 700 calories because it's what you do. You don't really have an objective rationale. So I think some people, they let their personality traits become an excuse for their behavior, and then they rationalize it like, oh no, I'm not crazy. I'm just an optimal bodybuilder. Like that classic quote in bodybuilding, obsessive is the word the lazy use to describe the dedicated. I'm always like, no, it's not. like there's only so much we can know that is actually optimal, and maximizing variables that we don't actually have that level of granularity or precision on, it's just making life worse. So hitting your macros within 5 grams in the off season, like, you don't know you're that accurate. Your energy expenditure is changing. This is just you holding on to something. This is a safety blanket. It's not actually improving your performance.
Yeah. And then that, like picking up from that, is like one that comes down to something you alluded to earlier, which is just having clarity on your goals, knowing how precise you need to be. And if you're at the end of a contest prep, then, you probably need to do some of that. But if not, no big deal. And the second thing is just, again, kind of back to the beginning of the conversation, is like people who are on the fence, who it's like, objectively speaking, for their goals, they don't need to track, but it is that anxiety and that fear of not tracking stopping them. I would just give it a try. Like, it's just, you have to just try it. And it just amazes me how, in that situation, when I'm working with someone who is like, because now I'm looking at their goals objectively, obviously I'm not them. So it's like, I know for their goals, they don't need to track. And it's like, once they get away from tracking, one, it amazes me how quickly they get used to not tracking. And two, how much they love not tracking. Where it's like, before they would have said, I need to track and I like to track. Where it's just like, wow, I don't need to track and I actually love not tracking. And it amazes me how quickly, I mean, like I said, like literally within a week, like if I think, like, I mean, it can happen so fast. Sometimes it's longer, obviously, but sometimes, I mean, it can be so fast. And it's just, you face the monster and you realize the monster is no big deal, and there was no monster. Like, and it's just, but until you actually do it, like, you can read about it, you can study it, you can think about it, but until you actually experience it, like, that anxiety is going to be there. Like, you have to actually transition away to know that it's going to be okay.
So what a really good analogy is? It's like training wheels on a bike. Like let's say your goal is to ride the Tour de France, and you've never ridden a bike before, and you start with training wheels, and that's day one. Like, immediately you're able to stay up, you won't fall over, and you've gone from, like, compared to someone who didn't get access to training wheels, like their whole first day is going to be falling down. On your first day, you can ride a bike, and it's like tracking gets you to an automatic passing grade, but you don't realize that you can't take a corner fast. You're not actually learning, like, how to lean and do all the things that comes naturally to, like, you're never going to be able to complete the Tour de France with training wheels at any reasonable speed. So you've like basically leapfrogged that early stage, found something workable immediately, but you don't realize that it's capped your performance because you can't even lean the bike. You're actually turning by turning the handles. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So and until you actually take the training wheels off, do you realize that there's this whole other new potential way of going forward? And that's not to say training wheels shouldn't be used. It's just more of like, when should they? And understanding that you have to fall down a little bit before you realize that falling down wasn't so bad. And that was actually how you learned the limit of your balance. And I think there is a time and a place, like you mentioned, like post-competition, of kind of instituting some of these little more hardline rules and quantitative things, or bringing tracking in and letting go of it. Like one objective tool that's causing me stress, but is probably also mitigating more stress than it's causing, is I signed up for a strongman comp, and I put myself entered into the under 90 kg category. And for those who don't know, like my lowest morning weigh-in during prep was right around 80 kgs. So, and then once I'd started eating up, I was weighing in around 81, 82. So very reasonable 1 month after comp to be 10% over stage weight. That's exactly what our recovery diet kind of end stage is. And for how lean I got, that's pretty reasonable, So now I have been tracking on and off and weighing myself every morning to make sure that I'm under 90 kilos, because that's the weight class I want to be in. But after Saturday, which is coming up just day after tomorrow here in New Zealand, I'm going to stop tracking. I'm going to stop stepping on the scale, and I'm just going to eat. And that's a little scary for me. And I know that I'm probably going to gain some weight, but so what? Like if I gain 3 kilos, I'm a 6-foot male at 92. Like, does that matter if like my abs fade a little bit more? Like, no, it doesn't. And it'll be a little intimidating, but I also know that's probably the way that I'll be able to let go of some of this additional food focus or this additional anxiety of looking at the scale and stepping on it. And then also not thinking about my hunger as much, but looking at these numbers. And so me trying to get back to not tracking is going to require a little bit of facing that monster for a while. And it's a reasonable time frame for that to happen after the 4 weeks post comp mark, once I've already gained 10 kilos. So it's basically using training wheels and then taking them off at the right time, knowing that you're going to fall down, but being able to ride the bike better versus just living life with training wheels on. So, yeah.
Yeah. And another thing along the same lines that I would love to hear your experience on, because I've noticed this, and it's something that I wouldn't have thought was possible. And I hear it all the time. It's a common misconception that it's not possible. But now I see that it is. And I'm curious to see if you've gotten away from tracking long enough for this to happen. So like if I go through my day right now, like I guess a thing that I always hear is like, okay, like once you get away from tracking, like the numbers will all because for example, like I tracked for 3 years, you track for 5 years. Like once you track for that long, the numbers are always going to be floating around in your head. But like I can tell from my experience is like those numbers go away. Like I don't think about those numbers anymore. Like I would have to, like you said, innovate. I would have to consciously, I could go back through my day and add up my calories. But just like right now, if you were to ask me how much I ate, I couldn't tell you. I would have to actually think. And so it's like, I would love to hear if you'd ever gotten away from tracking far enough to where it's like literally like those numbers do completely go away. Like I kind of go meal by meal to make sure I get at least, 40 grams of protein. I do some little stuff like meal by meal like that. But in terms of having an idea of where my calories are, I mean, I don't know within 1,000 right now. I mean, I would have to sit back and think. And have you been far enough away to where it's like the numbers actually do leave your head and you have to be conscious to bring them back in?
Yeah, they have. So let's say I'll give you some timeline stuff because I noticed this is a transient thing when you go back to tracking or away from it, is that it comes back and then it fades. So last time I tracked was like August 2012. Like I said, moved to New Zealand, and then I was here for 2 years, 2.5 years before I supervised a master's student, Simon Chatterton, and his intervention was putting people on a ketogenic diet for 8 weeks. Well, not ketogenic, but very low carb. So we capped carb intake at 1 gram per kg. So for a 200-pound male, that's like 90 grams of carbs per day. Ad libitum fat intake, and then no more within 10 grams of your habitual protein intake. So what we had to do was initially just track to see where we were at without modifying it. And I was like, oh, here's where I'm at. Like I didn't know. And I was like, oh, I'm only eating 170 grams of protein per day. Like that's okay, but it's like a little low for where I want to be. So then for the whole study for 8 weeks, I was in my fitness pal because I had to make sure I didn't go over 90 grams of carbs, and then I got within 160 to 180 grams of protein. So for 8 weeks and for the lead-in, so for a total of 12 weeks, I tracked. And at that point onward, I noticed that my tendencies were to, if I wasn't careful, undereat protein. And like I was thinking about meal to meal. Like I wouldn't have a meal that didn't have protein in it. I wouldn't just eat a bag of chips. But sometimes the meal would be like, especially because I changed to being like lacto-ovo-vegetarian. Like sometimes I wouldn't have any meat or anything like that. I wouldn't have access to Greek yogurt, and it'd just be a Quest bar. And I'm like, okay, I'm good. I had protein, but it's like, that's actually only 20 grams, So I would have days where I was at like 140, 150 grams of protein, which was probably like very, very minorly not optimal It was like 1.6 grams per kg of protein. I'm like, it's probably around 2 grams per kg just to be sure. But at that point, from that experience, I realized that yes, I had lost my view of where the numbers were because I wasn't even thinking about it. I was just making meal structure decisions, like you said. And then from that point on, I purposely started keeping track of protein. So the past 4 years, I have every day pretty much thought, where's my protein at? Where's my protein at? So that's influenced my decisions, but not necessarily do I know the calories. So it would just basically be portion sizes and everything based on hunger. I'd eat a bag of chips, or we'd go get some ice cream or whatever. But I would think, okay, that's like 3 grams of protein. Like that would be in my head, just the protein content. Yeah. And then so that's it. So I would eat whatever the hell I want, and then just make different decisions, like trying to always have, when we eat out, a meal that has a decent source of protein, in it. But that's kind of more like you were doing. But now since 2018, I had 2 mini cuts, and then I had my whole prep since January. Now I think it's going to be a while before those numbers fade and I don't focus on them. And I'm not even going to actually be enacting behaviors that will allow them to fade until, basically Sunday after the strongman comp, where I'm no longer trying to make weight for a certain competition. I think they will come and go depending on how much focus you give them. And I think that's the kind of thing, the slight difference between the Gen Pop person who is totally transitioning away from tracking versus the bodybuilder or powerlifter who is transitioning away from tracking as much as they can while staying within their weight class, or while ensuring they're in a surplus, or ensuring they're still hitting, like their protein targets, to make sure that they're hitting those big rocks as far as performance. So I would say, yes, they can fade away completely, but it's probably going to be related to how much you truly transition away from tracking, or how many of those behaviors you maintain for your goals.
I think that's so well said. Absolutely. And it's just, I think it's cool to hear from like that insight as well. Because again, like I would have never thought that years ago, like when I was in the heart of tracking, like there's no way these numbers are ever going to fade away. I'm going to go through the rest of my life and these numbers are always going to be floating around in my head. And it's just like, I think it's just a cool insight for somebody who hasn't transitioned away, might be on the fence of transitioning away, and they've found themselves being obsessed with these numbers. It's just, I think that's kind of like hope at the end of the tunnel, right? Like they can fade away, like, and they do fade away. And then just also kind of like something else, like piggybacking off of that is like right now, since I do have performance related goals, I don't track my calorie intake, but I do track certain targets. So like the things that I track right now, I have an Excel sheet just like I used to have when I was tracking, protein, fat, and carbs, or when I was tracking calories or whatever. But what I track now is servings of fruits per day, servings of vegetables per day. I track protein feedings. So I make sure that I get in, I want to have at least 2 fruits. I want to have at least 4 servings of vegetables. I want to have at least 4 protein feedings, a feeding being at least 40 grams. Typically each one's closer to 50, but those are the new nutritional targets that I track right now, are just those 3 things. And so it's like that allows me to kind of go meal by meal. And okay, am I getting my 4 meals throughout the day that have at least 40 grams of protein? Am I getting my, are some of those meals having at least a fruit or a veggie? And so am I hitting those total targets? And then I track my body weight. I mean, heck, I might even grab it at this point just a couple of times a month. And that's enough just to make sure. I mean, like, it's like if you don't need to gain or lose weight, or if you're just kind of in a maintenance phase or whatever, like you don't need to constantly weigh yourself every day. It's like you can just have your habits in place, have your structure in place, make sure you're executing that. But I don't need to constantly be hopping on a scale or constantly doing all this stuff if I know my training is improving and I know I'm getting my protein, fruits and veggies in. Absolutely.
Yeah. The weigh-in frequency goes way down, and it's more of just like, am I where I think I am? And you almost always are when you're at that phase, when you're weighing at that level. It's almost, again, just kind of like, I'm just going to give my safety blanket a little hug real quick, So yeah, I totally agree. Steve, are there other more, like one thing you mentioned earlier is I don't want to just talk about this theoretically or experientially. I want to give people some kind of takeaway tools, or any other tools you think would be useful to emphasize for our podcast listeners. Yeah, so I know we went through kind of like the hunger signals. Do you want to go through satiety, or what rating scales you use, or things you found that are useful?
I would love to circle back to a question you asked me a while ago was, how do I help people differentiate between cravings and hunger? And I would
Yeah.
love to circle back and maybe, give some more strategies there and go through that hunger-fullness scale that I don't know if I've gone through that in a podcast, but I did go through it in the video. But because we've talked so much about this and I found that tool to be so helpful, I think that would be something that's useful to share.
Perfect.
So I guess just going back to if we look at the, cravings versus actual hunger question, I guess there's a few ways that I look at that. Like one, like when we talk about, cravings versus actual like physical hunger is when you're trying to differentiate which it is, like I said, what you're trying to do is just tune into those physical sensations you're experiencing. The things you're trying to tune out are, one I touched on was your emotional state. And the other thing, which was something you touched on, was things in your environment. So if it's a certain time of day, if you hear a certain song, if you see cookies on the table, those are the two things you're trying to block out. Is you're trying to ignore your emotional state and you're trying to ignore anything in your environment that may be prompting you to eat, and you're just trying to tune into how you're feeling. Along with that, one thing that can just help reduce just, I guess you could say, cravings in general, or your, giving into a craving, is just not letting yourself get too hungry. Because even if you hear a song or see cookies, if you're not that hungry and you have this strong motivation to move in the direction of your goals, it's easy to say no to the cookies. But if you're starving, even if you have that really strong motivation to do this stuff, but you're starving and you see the cookies there, man, it's hard, right? Like, that's freaking hard. Like, lock me in a car with some pizza for 4 hours, I'm going to eat the pizza. Like, it's just going to happen. So a way to help you kind of, and the thing that I used to kind of help learn what different levels of hunger and fullness feel like, is this Hunger-Fullness Scale. And I guess it's people who probably have the video, this will make a bit more sense. People who are just listening to the audio, it might be might be hard to get, but maybe we can link the actual visual to this in the show notes. But if I look at, let's say, like hunger and fullness, I kind of set it on a scale, and it goes from 1 to 10. A 1 being you're ravenous, a 3 being a normal level of hunger, a 5 being neutral, meaning you're not experiencing any hunger sensations or any fullness sensations, an 8 being you're at a normal level of fullness, and then a 10 being you're stuffed. And so what you do is you kind of use that scale initially to help you define and learn what different levels of hunger and fullness feel like to you. And the way that I do it is I start off in the middle and I ask the question, am I physically hungry at all? And when I do that, I'm trying to tune out my current emotional state. And like sometimes I'll even like look down or try to zone out or close my eyes so I can ignore anything in my environment. And just, am I physically hungry at all? And by asking the thing at all, it lets you know which half of the scale you're currently on. Because if you say, I am not physically hungry at all, then you know it's a craving because you're not hungry. Like, if you're not experiencing any physical sensations that are prompting you to eat, then you know it's a craving. And that also means your number is going to be somewhere between a 5 and a 10. But if you are hungry at all, that lets you know your number is going to be somewhere between a 1 and a 5. So, and then from there, I just tune in further and I give myself, a specific number to the nearest 0.5. I guess, again, I'm not trying to get too much into that because I don't want it to sound convoluted, because it's kind of like this abstract concept. But what I think
that was pretty clear, man. I think
was that pretty clear?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, totally.
What I like to do is, for the most of the time, and again, it depends on goals and things like that. For me personally, what I like to do, especially at this point, is I like to keep myself between a 3 and a 7.5. So a 3 being that normal level of hunger. And my rationale for this, back to kind of that pizza thing I was talking about, is like, if I keep myself above a 3, it prevents me from experiencing extreme hunger, which is what would often lead me to eat the pizza or to eat the cookies or to cave into that craving. So if I keep myself at a 3, it's going to make it much easier to say no to that stuff and stay in line with my goals. And then the reason that I like to stay at about a 7.5 or lower, which is, like I said, it's just slightly lower than full, is because it helps me maintain good energy and good mental clarity throughout the day. So yeah, when I was because again, we all know that if we eat too much, then we get tired, we feel bloated, we have a decrease in mental clarity, it gets hard to think. And not to turn into a tangent, but that's something when I was just bodybuilding, all I really worried about was my training. And so I really didn't care if I was bloated and full and tired as long as I was getting my calories in. But now that I'm trying to like run my business, train, and like do all these different things, I can't just be like peaking for 2 hours a day and then nose diving for the others. And like, that same thing as well. It's like, you can't be effective what you do if you're only peaking for a 2 hour period in the middle of the day, and then you feel like crap the rest of the day. So I've just found that keeping myself between that 3 and that 7.5, it helps me make better decisions and not eat the junk food. And also it helps keep my energy more balanced, so I'm more productive in all these different areas and just in general as I go through the day. So just using
that's really good. I think that's another reason why I like to get people really focused on performance postseason, because like you get to a point where it's really difficult to actually have a meal structure when you're on restricted calories and you're always a little glycogen depleted and you're always a little bit hungry, to where you could like mess yourself up on a deficit to where you're like, oh, I only feel good right now, but I feel like crap the rest of the day because your calories are too low. But in the off season, you can definitely do that. And like, I think Andrea talked about this on a few previous podcasts, like when she started really having like very high performance related goals, kind of the functional fitness training she was doing, and she still does, like, I'm not going to eat a massive meal before I train. I feel like crap. Like I think about how my meals affect my digestive tract and how that has knock-on effects with my energy levels and my performance. And I think that's a really useful thing to focus on. Like I've training for strongman, you have to get into uncomfortable positions and do things that, like, pulling a truck is not the same as just like doing curls, and like wrapping my arms around a stone and picking it up and having to I don't want to have a bloated stomach while I'm trying to lift up a 118 kilo round object that I have to like be in like a shitting on the ground position to grab in the first place. Like I feel like my food's going to give me a hernia if I'm bloated, or like when I was doing Olympic lifting, like there was a lot of things that just don't go well with bloating. But you can certainly get away with it. Like I think bodybuilders think about it on leg day sometimes, but they're doing chest and back. They don't give a shit, and I think that that coinciding with like the mentality of just the seafood diet, SEE, or restricting calories, you kind of forget that there is that downside to overeating and undereating as far as performance that you can get tuned in again with in the off season. So that's really a good point.
It just hearing you say that, it just makes me reflect and think back to like how unnecessarily hard I used to make it, like how often I was bloated and how often I was like tired at random parts of the day when it didn't have to be like that, but just because of the way I was doing things, it was like that. But it's just, man, I think about that, it's like I was making like the other parts of my day so much harder because I was just trying to peak for this small window of training, where it's like, had I actually like also gotten feedback from my body, I could have made myself, like I would have known how to structure my food to hit my protein and calorie goals, but also to make myself be productive and like be able to focus consistently throughout the day and not, feel sluggish for 2 hours, feel good for 30 minutes, feel sluggish for 2 hours. It just makes me think back on that.
Yeah. One thing I really liked, how I think you very clearly help people differentiate between cravings and hunger. One thing I would want to add to that is that the answer is not always to not give into cravings, though, too. Like the question I ask myself now is, how will I feel because I could just restrain myself and not give in any of my cravings. That's not a problem for me, but that has an effect too. There is a downside to feeling in a constant state of restraint, because it's like trying not to think about something. You're thinking about it, So I know that by not giving into cravings, it enhances my food preoccupation. I know that because I just did it for 8 months, right? And so I think there is value at certain stages of, if you have a craving and it's strong, maybe you should listen to it, but it's also then what's the why behind it? How often and how frequent does it happen? How does it align with your goals? What's the source of why you have these? Is it really just the only coping strategy or tool you have, But in my case, I know I'm not an emotional eater. I don't use food as a coping strategy. Never have. That's not me. So right now, if I'm constantly craving sweets, should I be giving into them sometimes? 4 weeks post-comp? Probably. That's actually not a bad idea. Like if you really want donuts in your 4 weeks post-comp, you should probably have donuts, because you're going to want donuts until you don't. I think that's something that you see a lot of competitors get stuck in this loop post-season is they're trying to follow their reverse diet or whatever their post-competition strategy is to not have an unreasonable blowout. And they're just being a little too overly restrained to try to manage how much weight they gain or to keep some semblance of condition or to manage the pace. And it inadvertently extends the time period it would take, and I think it's difficult for people to know that until they've experienced it, because probably the first season they had was a huge blowout and they think it'll be that if I don't restrain myself. But what I found is that it takes less restraint to have a smaller blowout in subsequent seasons. And then what ends up happening is the person goes to the other end of the extreme and they follow like the reverse diet thing, and they find themselves just 6 months post-comp, objectively in a great off-season body comp, but still food focused, and still having these cravings, but they're just fighting them back. And I think the cravings will remain until they actually just listen to them, and actually have those cravings. Because in the off season, we literally have a donut shop right next to our house. I walk by it every day. I don't even think about it. Like, why am I going to eat donuts? I'm a bodybuilder. But post season, maybe two days a week, I want donuts. I don't have them both days, but I definitely allow myself to have donuts probably once or twice a week right now, because I feel like that every time I do it, I don't want donuts as much the next time. Each week I've noticed in the past 4 weeks, the donut cravings have gone down. So it's kind of like a third rating scale. You get your hunger, you get your satiety, and you have like your donut desire. That's the DD.
Yeah.
But that might only have, but that's going to be applied very differently in someone who has a not very good healthy relationship with food versus someone who has a healthy relationship with food but just starved themselves for 8 months. That's two different scenarios.
I'm so glad you added that piece, because it definitely didn't want to make it seem like if you're not physically hungry, then you can't eat. So, because I'm so glad you added that piece. Like, you still have the option of eating even if you're not hungry. Because I think back to even a particular situation, I had a client who, it was like once a year, he goes to this farm, and the people make this amazing pie. And he knows it's super high calories or whatever. And he's and his goal is fat loss. He's like, is it okay, if I have a piece or two of the pie? He's like, I know it's going to put me over. And I'm just eat the pie, man. We're talking about, for one, the whole reason we're doing this stuff anyway is to improve your quality of life. So if we start putting things on you where now it's having a negative impact on your quality of life, now we miss the whole point of why we're doing this stuff. And the second thing is it's just going to wash out and it's no big deal. But I'm so glad you mentioned that, because for him, it was in that situation, he was going to be eating the pie probably when he wasn't hungry, because it would be after dinner. He probably could have easily not had the pie, but it's this is something he gets once a year, and it's this special homemade pie, and these people make it, and it's just, I guess it's incredible. And it's just no, have the pie. Even if you're not hungry, eat the pie. So
100%. Eating is so much more than there may have been a time before we really formed, societies or even tribes that had ready access to food, where it was just about, when I have access to food, I eat it, and it's purely based on my survival needs. But since society has been society, food has taken the role of more than just fulfilling our energy needs, right? It has cultural implications, pleasure, bonding. Grandmothers of all cultures are known for overfeeding, because it's a way of showing affection to their, the juniors in their family. And no one's hungry on their third plate of Thanksgiving. Let's be honest. We're all eating purely for hedonistic pleasure and bonding with our family and for celebration, right? And that is totally okay. And another thing that people are forgetting is that this whole kind of what we've been talking about is essentially food autoregulation by listening to your body's signals. They don't stop. They don't clock out when you go to bed. One thing I look back when I was a teenager is I used to play video games for a whole day, and forget to eat. And then the next day I would crush like a whole large pizza and then go to Taco Bell. And then I would forget the next day to eat. Like my hunger signals would be affected by the prior day. Like the few times during previous contest preps where I did actually feel full and then not have a desire to eat the next day was when I binged post show. Like I remember in '09, I did 5 shows, and each show, even though I had more shows to do, I would have like the traditional bodybuilder meal after a show of eat until you're uncomfortable. I don't do that anymore. I just don't think it's healthy or necessary, and I don't have the desire to do it. I just eat what I want at a restaurant and get an appetizer and dessert. But like the next day, I didn't want to eat. Like then I was like, oh, I haven't had this experience in 4 months. So like it's just important to remember that even if you do like push it and redline it and you eat when you're not hungry, that just means the next day you're probably going to be even less hungry and it will even out. You know, like I know plenty of people who have healthy lifestyles and a good relationship with food and listen to their hunger and satiety signals who do whatever the hell they want on you know, in the holidays. There's an old it might be a Lyle McDonald article where he was just talking about how every Christmas he's face down on a plate of fudge. And he's like, and I don't gain weight overall. Like my weight's stable. You know, it's like, how does that happen? The math doesn't add up. Yeah, it does. You just eat less for the few days afterwards. And I think that's sometimes why some of the strategies we use that are super quantitative, like, all right, you're just going to fast all day and then go, like you're going to eat more because of that. Mm-hmm. Or like when people are like, hey, I messed up. Should I, like I was trying to reverse diet or do my recovery diet and I overate. Should I now cut the next day? And I'm like, no, that just perpetuates it. It keeps it going. Like, just forget about it. And you might find that it naturally corrects itself. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind is that these strategies, although we might have you rate your hunger or satiety in a given 24-hour period, yesterday's satiety and hunger signals are going to affect today, you know?
Mm-hmm. And that's why it's like, maybe if you weren't, because I agree with everything you said. And if you weren't a star bodybuilder right now, it's like, I wonder if it would be this way as well, as like in this example with the donuts. Like if I have donuts one day and it does put me way over, then the next day, like you said, I'm just naturally not as hungry. It's not a forced thing. I'm not trying to restrict. I'm just in tune and I'm just not hungry. And because I don't have these predetermined targets where now I have to like force myself to eat, you know, because now I have this baseline. It's like, because I can just naturally go with the ebbs and flows, I'll have less the next day. And now the donuts literally meant nothing. Like it literally didn't set me back at all. And it's like, I mean, have you experienced the same thing? I mean, maybe not right now, but when you're in your off season, like
to a lesser degree, even right now, like I've never had donuts 2 days in a row in the last 4 weeks, you know, like if I have it, and it's not because I'm actively restricting myself. Like I said, when a craving comes up, and I assess it's reasonable with my weight gain. I think about all that stuff. And will I feel restrained if I don't have it? Or will I feel resentfully or negatively restrained? Like how much restraint will it take? It's never resulted in me having donuts 2 days in a row. And it's not because I'm like, you can't have donuts 2 days in a row. I've had dessert 2 days in a row. Like actually, the donut shop was closed when I didn't expect it to be 2 days ago. And I was like, God damn it. And I ended up walking down the street and I had, I think, chocolate barfi, which is an Indian dessert based on condensed milk. And it was good, but it really did not hit the donut spot. So the next day I noticed I still had a donut craving. So I had donuts that day, but then I didn't the day after. So the cravings themselves have some kind of impact on subsequent cravings. Like you had that client, it's no different than the client who's asking you, like, am I going to crave junk foods forever? I'm like, no. And you don't need to necessarily do cold turkey to get away from it, you know? So it's much more just like incorporating new foods and just decreasing the frequency is going to have a huge impact. So yeah, I think obviously I had almost zero cravings for donuts without being prompted by a sensory cue in the off season. Like the off season, yeah, if I had, like you said, if I was hungry, like I'd missed a meal, I'd been in a really long meeting and my step count was really high and I worked out. And then we had dinner and we walked by a donut shop. I'm like, oh, I'm still hungry. Those donuts smell good. Barb, let's get some donuts. But that would happen like once every 4 months because it would need those convergence of factors. But like yesterday, I had just eaten a meal. We're sitting up and we're watching Netflix and I'm finding I'm just distracted. I'm like, I want donuts right now. And there was no sensory cue. Like, I've got like a cat next to me and we're watching Netflix and I just had a salad with potatoes and I actually feel bloated. Like there's no reason I should want donuts, but I do. This is purely just my brain going, hey dude, you should eat some donuts because you were lean for a while, so like, okay, sure. That. So I think but yeah, like you said, if I wasn't a star bodybuilder, it's, man, two times a year that I have something like that. Just randomly, it's not random. It's because of those converging factors.
Yeah. And then like, I mean, just kind of along those same lines and going back to that, what you were saying about Lyle McDonald, like his quote is like, if you have that new normal where you have your habits in place, it's like those few days where you go off, like, because that's not your new normal routine, like you just go back and like, it just doesn't matter. Like, yeah. And that, like you're saying, that's the benefit that, I kind of skipped around, but that's the benefit that like, being attuned to your hunger and fullness sensations gives you, is it just gives you that flexibility where it's like, you don't have to worry about hitting these certain targets. Like you have other options. You can actually just pay attention to how you're feeling.
Yeah.
So I think maybe just the final thing that I could think of, and then if you have anything that you think we need to add, would be, we talked about common hunger sensations, but we didn't really talk about, fullness a ton. So maybe just a little bit on that. Because like, as we both know, like when you track, you don't typically lose touch with the extremes. Like you never really lose touch with what it feels like to be ravenous, and you never really lose touch with what it feels like to be sick or stuffed from eating too much. But it's those milder physiological states in the middle that become harder to identify.
Yeah, well said.
If I was to, describe, if we're talking about satisfied, what satisfied feels like, the two things I would say would be, one, it's, you might have the feeling of something in your stomach, could be a good indication that you're satisfied. And the second thing to pair with that would be the alleviation of the hunger sensations you were previously experiencing. So if you were feeling lightheaded, you were feeling weak, and you were having difficulty concentrating, a good indication that you are satisfied would be you no longer are experiencing those negative sensations, and you maybe can feel something in your stomach, but you also don't feel full. So again, if I was to just, in one sentence, describe what satisfied feels like, I would say you don't feel hungry, but you don't feel full. It's that sweet spot right in the middle where you're not really experiencing sensations in either direction.
Yep. Yeah. You feel the sensation of something in your stomach. And for me, I know the word that kind of clicks. So when I ask myself, do I need food right now? And sometimes I'm like, no, I want food. Like my pants are a little stretched. I have a little feeling of like very mild bloat in my stomach, and I don't need food. Like I just ate, I'm fine. And then I can differentiate. Oh, I want food. That's a craving. That's just because I want to eat some shit, and then that it's interesting. I bet there's different leptin and ghrelin relationships with those different sensations, which I think recover at different rates, and then insulin as well. But anyway, it's just interesting to see how in lean bodies versus not lean bodies, those can have different impacts. So I think that's really well said. I have nothing else to add, Steve. One cool thing I would like to let the audience know is probably closer to the end of the year, Steve and I've got a pretty cool course that's going to be coming out in the 3DMJ Vault, specifically about how to transition away from tracking. That'll give you a lot more nuance and takeaway tools and some of the supporting research around all this. So just stay tuned for that. And we will catch you next time on the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
Hey guys, this is Coach Alberto Nunez. Thanks so much for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. I wanted to take a moment to remind you guys that we have a giant video library of educational materials at 3dmjvault.com. The Vault is a place where we have organized our best information, paired it up with some of our favorite resources, and shared with all of you guys in one online database. We have courses on contest prep, hypertrophy, posing, fat loss, postseason recovery, and a whole lot more. Most of it is free. Some of it is for purchase to help support this podcast, and we continue adding pieces of updated content to it every couple of months that members always have unlimited access to. Once again, that's 3dmjvault.com, and we really hope you like it.